Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're watching from and joining us. We're delighted to have you with us. I'm Fred Lawrence, the Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Thank you all for being with us today, and particularly thank you for what brings you to be among the people invited to this event. Originally, this idea came up, well, two ways this idea came up. One, and I'll say a word of introduction about Lynn Pasquerella in a second. Lynn and I have the um, opportunity to work together closely now with Lynn as our board chair and me as CEO. So we talk on about a weekly basis, and we talk about a lot of things, including the future of the liberal arts and sciences and the challenges. And so we thought, instead of just doing this privately as we do once a week, why don't we open it up and get some other people involved in it? So that was part of the idea. The other was the matching campaign that we did, a sort of a little mini campaign over the last couple of months, and many of you supported that. I'm especially grateful to our generous anonymous donor. You know who you are. Thank you for that and for your prior support for Phi Beta Kappa. I'm delighted to say that well over 600 donors participated in this matching campaign that brought in nearly 40,000 additional dollars to Phi Beta Kappa. We need these resources for all of the work we do in advocating for the liberal arts and sciences and free expression, free inquiry, as you all know. So I'm grateful to all of you who participated. And I know many of you are members of the Secretary Circle. So I'm particularly grateful, Secretary Circle members. One of the benefits we like to think of for Secretary Circle members is that when I travel, I come see you where you are. This hasn't been a year for that, but I'm glad that we've been able to stay in touch electronically. And this is a continuation of that ongoing conversation of issues that we all care about deeply in support of the liberal arts and sciences. So one housekeeping note, and then we'll jump in. We have some questions that we've already received that people sent in advance. Thank you, and we'll incorporate those in our conversation. In addition, if you have questions as we go along, please put them in the chat function. Those will be monitored, and then through miracle of technology, will come out in a text on my iPad. So we'll get to those as we go. If you don't get your question answered right away, it doesn't mean somebody didn't see it. It just meant it's gone in the hopper, and we'll work it through. So with that, let me turn to the great pleasure I have of introducing my dear friend and colleague, Lynn Pasquerella. Lynn and I first met when we were both university presidents in Massachusetts, and I was at Brandeis, Lynn was at Holyoke, and we met through the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities in Massachusetts, and pretty quickly figured out that we were the two who wanted to be able to pass notes to each other during those meetings, because these things sometimes work out that way. Lynn had, from part of her deep involvement in Phi Beta Kappa, was on her way to being vice chair of the board and then chair of the board, and was on the search committee that brought me to Phi Beta Kappa. So in many ways, for me, one of the great pleasures of this has been to be able to work closely with Lynn. After Holyoke, Lynn became president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. From that perch, she is one of the major voices in the country on issues facing higher education generally, liberal arts and sciences in particular. And so comes to this conversation both with the deep Phi Beta Kappa connection and her own background. So Lynn, thank you for all you do for Phi Beta Kappa and for years of friendship and for all that we've been able to accomplish together and will yet. And I'm delighted to spend the next hour together and share this conversation with some of our most devoted supporters.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So let's put the ball in play here on a question that I know I get asked a lot, and I know you get asked a lot, which is the effect of the pandemic on higher education, both in terms of where we are now and as you think about the lasting effects as we look down the road. Maybe there's a light at the end of the tunnel, although goodness knows there's plenty of tunnel left too. How do you see the pandemic affecting higher education present and on into the future?
Yeah. I mean, while colleges and universities across the country exhibited remarkable resilience in the transition to remote and online learning, in the process, there was heightened awareness brought to the food and shelter insecurities experienced by students at all types of institutions. And simultaneously, there was unveiled the expansiveness of the digital divide when we saw students lining up in digital parking lots to get access to the internet or to computers in the first place. And we also know that in the 5 months that followed the initial mid-March closure of campuses, more than 51 million Americans filed for unemployment benefits due to job losses, exacerbating this already tenuous status of low-income students. And though demand for higher education traditionally increases during times of economic recessions, there was a 13.1% decrease last fall in first-year students, leading to an overall 2.5% decline. And there was a 43% decline in first-time international students, leading to a 16% drop. This all has a significant impact on revenue for colleges and universities, not only because of the decline in student enrollment that was precipitated by this move to online learning, but many institutions had to close down their campus operations altogether, losing revenue from summer programs, from other revenue sources. And so they have implemented tuition freezes, furloughs, travel bans, cut programs primarily in the arts, humanities, social sciences in favor of STEM programs that are seen as singularly able to respond to demands for employability. And we saw in Florida 2 weeks ago legislation that was introduced that would limit scholarship funding for students who were going to major in fields that weren't deemed immediately employable by legislators, whatever that means today. So these are some of the challenges that are facing colleges and universities. But despite those extraordinary challenges brought about by COVID-19, the ensuing economic crisis, I think this is a moment to radically reimagine higher education. We've seen already the ways in which admissions policies have changed. There's been a suspension of SATs and ACTs following, of course, upon the Varsity Blues scandal. But there was also an incredible sharing of resources where colleges and universities were working together to provide open educational resources, to work on pedagogies and exchanging curricula in the face of this need to pivot to remote learning. So we have gained a greater understanding of how colleges and universities can leverage technology to engage in collaboration locally and globally. And we've also learned about the necessity of a 21st century liberal education in preparing students for success in work, citizenship, and life. The global pandemic has demonstrated why and liberal education for the 21st century and beyond must be applied, integrative, must challenge students to grapple with real world problems in the context of the workforce, not apart from it. So these are some of the lessons, and I think there's a way forward for us.
Yeah. You know, when you and I were presidents, the big challenge was coming out of the 08-09 financial crisis. Mm-hmm. And I know one of the things that we tried to do was to find ways of collaborating with other schools in our area. Obviously, to be a college or university president in the greater Boston area, there are so many different colleges and universities that trustees would say, how is it possible that everybody has to offer, a course in intermediate German? I mean, do you need to have 20 of those courses in the greater Boston area? The challenge, and you, as obviously at Holyoke, as part of the 5-college system, which was always part of a consortium of sorts, but the challenge was all this prosaic stuff. How are you going to get people in the same classroom at the same time? How do you get from Waltham or Brandeis to Wellesley, let alone all the way to Cambridge, in order to sit in that German language class? And then almost on a dime last spring, that changes. I mean, one of the most astonishing things, it seems to me, last spring, and it bears saying because it's so obvious we tend to miss it. Let's be honest, higher education is not known for the velocity at which it changes. The joke used to be that higher education is where glaciers go to relax. And then all of a sudden, within weeks, millions of students are transitioned from in-class, in-person to online. Thousands of professors, many of whom really bristled at the whole idea of distance learning, are learning how to use it and then starting tentatively to email to each other, this isn't so bad, I see opportunities here. So things that 10 years ago were challenging, at least in part, the practicalities of it seem now to have, I'm not going to say disappeared, let's just say they become easier.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree. And that efficiency that we've captured now with this new medium for learning has raised questions about whether we can allocate resources in new and different ways. So you're right. When I was at Mount Holyoke, we looked at whether we should offer a Russian studies program, knowing that Amherst and UMass had very strong programs, that the 5 colleges offered 93 different languages: Urdu, Hindi, Arabic, 10 sections of Chinese. So, but what does that mean for individual faculty members? And these are the battles that are being played out on college campuses. And so much of it is reflective of what we value at particular institutions. And I know that this has been an issue that has come up for you in Phi Beta Kappa when faculty have reached out to say, I'm worried because my president or my chancellor is looking at a proposal to cut certain programs. And what does this mean for the centrality of liberal education and our Phi Beta Kappa chapter? So are there many local PBK chapters in abeyance this year as a result of the financial constraints that colleges are facing?
As you know, this is a day in, day out issue. Abeyance is probably too strong. No chapter has been suspended, but it is fair to say that there are a number of chapters that are under stress, or campuses with the liberal arts is under stress. And of course, one of the remarkable things, even though our chapters are only fewer than 10% of all the colleges and universities in this country have Phi Beta Kappa chapters, but we still represent, as you know, this astonishing range of schools that we have, big and small. We have public and private. We have faith-based and non-faith-based. And I mention that because every single one of those categories is involved in this. This is not a big school problem or a standalone small school problem. Big state universities are feeling the strain because state university budgets have been under stress. In the real value of dollars since 1987, public contribution to public education has gone down 25%. I don't doubt that there was some fat that could be trimmed, but there was not 25% fat that could be trimmed. So you're hitting into muscle when you start doing that kind of cutting at state universities. Small private liberal arts colleges, the very highly endowed ones that many people talk about, they'll survive through this period. But you don't have to go very far down the hierarchy before you hit a lot of schools that are going to have challenges. And as we have talked about, Mills College, a prominent historic women's college in the San Francisco Bay Area, has announced it's going to close business or transform itself into an institute on women's leadership and cease giving bachelor's degrees after it graduates the students who are there. Faith-based schools as well are under this kind of strain. So what we have done is work closely with the members of the administration of those campuses. We do it offline, but we do it transparently with the chapters themselves. So if our members, people listening to this conversation, don't read about it in the papers, that's not an accident, that's an on purpose. We're not one of those organizations that writes from the outside and that criticizes the administration. I don't find that a very effective way for us to do business. Rather, I've had conversations with dozens of university presidents by now, asking what their plans are, how they plan to protect the liberal arts on their campus, and then confirming that to the chapter. So the chapter are our boots on the ground. So far, I would say I am cautiously optimistic on most of our campuses that these are schools that are wrestling with real financial challenges and are trying to make that all balance out. A different question, of course, are places that, finances aside, have decided to begin to turn the ship in the direction of more applied study, more technical study. Those are challenging for us because at some point, that is not the liberal arts anymore. At some point, that is a different kind of education. And I wonder from your perch, what you, the concern, I think I'm freezing here a little bit, what you see of schools that say, it's precisely because of the uncertain economy that we simply have to move in a more applied direction. Mm-hmm. Students want to know about jobs. Mm-hmm. Mom and dad want to know about jobs. What are you going to do with that fill in the blank here major that won't do anything? It's not just Florida, right? It's mom and dad sending somebody off to school, or it's a young person who saved money to go to school who says, it's a luxury I can't afford.
Right. Yeah, and one of the reasons I love talking to you every Monday morning is that the mission of Phi Beta Kappa and the Association of American Colleges and Universities are so aligned. And at AAC&U, we have since 2006 done surveys of employers on what they value most among college graduates and what they're looking for. And uniformly, it is graduates who have not narrow majors, expertise in a particular major, but the capacity to apply knowledge in different contexts across the curriculum. And what we find is that they value critical thinking skills, the ability to communicate orally and in writing, the capacity to engage in moral imagination, imagining what it's like to be in the shoes of another different from oneself. And now we're finding in our latest survey, which took place at the end of 2020 and will be released in April, is that they're looking for those capacities around adaptability, flexibility, the skills that are necessary to not only enter the workforce, but to advance in the workforce. So the findings through these studies have been reinforced through service I had on National Academies Commission that David Scorton headed that led to a consensus report, Branches from the Same Tree.
Okay.
And this showed that the integration of the arts and humanities with STEM is more critical than ever. In a world where rapidly changing technology means rapid obsolescence, and in a globally interdependent world. And the title of this report, Branches from the Same Tree, was taken from a quote by Albert Einstein, who in the midst of burgeoning fascist power pointed to the dangers in the foundations of knowledge that were being corrupted and manipulated and coerced by political forces. And he maintained that all religions, arts, and sciences are branches from the same tree. And the report found the need to achieve more effective forms of capacity building for 21st century workers and citizens through the acquisition of broad-based skills across all disciplines that can be flexibly deployed. So this is the direction for higher education. And then you and I had the privilege of writing together a piece that focused on Tony Carnevale's research in the Georgetown Education Center that showed the inextricable link between a liberal education and anti-authoritarian tendencies. And if we look at what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, just a few blocks from our houses, we know that this historic mission of educating for democracy in our nation is more critical than ever. And this is where Phi Beta Kappa can play a leadership role.
We talk about the liberal education as preparing us for meaningful lives, which is the one we normally focus on, but also productive lives and engaged lives. And I know we both have this experience of, depending on where you speak, sometimes there are faculty, and actually sometimes not faculty, sometimes non-academics will get concerned if we slide off of the meaningful life prong of the liberal arts and talk about the productive aspect of it, as if somehow we're giving away the game. It seems to me that we can talk about both. As a matter of fact, we can talk about all three. It's both the meaningful life, the productive life in the workplace, and the engaged life of citizens. As you say, all of the research that has shown that liberal education is actually essential to a functioning democracy, to a self-governing people. It's not an accident that Phi Beta Kappa was founded the same year as the country in 1776. It's not a coincidence. They were part of the same movement. What was in the air? What does it mean to have a society that doesn't have an aristocracy, that doesn't inherit its system from those who are our betters, from whom we have to do what we're told, but rather a system that grows from the bottom up? It was premised on the idea of an educational system, an incomplete promise in 1776, to be sure, not a completely realized promise in 2021 either. But the notion that average citizens of no particular background will be able to find a way to get educated to the point that they can participate in that society. When you talk about the workplace, Einstein's a pretty good example from a ways back. I'm preparing for an induction ceremony I'm doing in a couple of hours. It's the first one I'm doing this season. And I intend to share a great Steve Jobs quote that I came upon. This was when they launched, I'm going to read it here, when they launched the iPad 2 back in 2011. He said, "It's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with the liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the results that make our hearts sing." My guess is that when he went off record, he thought, and also returned higher value to shareholders. It is what made it such a productive product, that it wasn't just the technology, it wasn't just the coders. So you and I agree on this, which isn't surprising. We've been having versions of this conversation for years. Why do you think this message has been so hard to land in so many places in the country? Well, I have always said, if people don't understand how important what you're doing is, it's probably not that they're not smart enough to understand it. It's you haven't done a very good job explaining it. Mm-hmm. So have we as a sector just not done as good a job as we should explaining the value of a liberal arts education, a liberal arts degree?
Yes, I think we could do much more. We've been complicit in this. There is a prevailing national rhetoric that calls into question the value of higher education in general and liberal education in particular. And we need to work with a renewed sense of urgency and contest accusations of irrelevancy and illegitimacy that have been lodged against academics. And we are seen as existing within the ivory tower as a willful disconnect from the practical matters of everyday life. The criticisms that have been brought, the reason that there's been a rapid decline in public trust in higher education, have to do with the fact that we're seen as too expensive, too difficult to access, as not teaching people 21st century skills. Not everybody has the luxury of studying in this pastoral retreat without being concerned about work. And so to restore public trust in higher education and destabilize cultural attitudes at the basis of proposals that devalue liberal education and those who've rejected it, we need to reframe the narrative, highlighting the fact that in a global knowledge economy, employer demand for a liberal education is growing. At the same time, we need to take seriously these underlying concerns and belie Michael Sandel's notions that he forefronts in his latest book, namely that if you don't go to college and if you're not flourishing in the new economy, then the failure must be your own fault. How can we create access to excellence in higher education in ways that include everybody and recouple higher education and the American dream, which has been decoupled? We've seen the statistics that came out this week on the decline in the number of male students who are going to college. They're finding that the workforce is more important to them. They can't invest in long-term success because they feel a sense of immediacy with respect to supporting their families. We need to be a visible force in our communities. All colleges and universities have to serve as anchor institutions, demonstrating that their success is intertwined with the economic, social, psychological, educational well-being of those in the communities in which they're located and those they seek to serve, if we ever hope to make a difference.
We talk about the common program and common interests of Phi Beta Kappa and the AAC&U. One of the ways in which we're different, and I think you have an interesting experience I'd love you to share with people. You have many more members than we do. We have 290 chapters. You've got, over 1,500 institutions. So all of our members, all of our campuses that shelter Phi Beta Kappa chapters, by definition, are liberal arts universities or have a major liberal arts component. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a chapter. That's not true of the AAC&U. At the same time, your major periodical is called Liberal Education, not liberal like the politics, but liberal like the liberal arts. So talk a little bit about the role of the liberal arts, not just in a liberal arts school, the role of the liberal arts in a non-liberal arts university, the role of the liberal arts in technology programs, in pre-professional programs, in communications, nursing, those kinds of disciplines.
Yeah, this is something very dear to me. I'm an applied ethicist. I do medical ethics, philosophy of law, engineering ethics, business ethics. And, I think the best illustration is what has happened with COVID-19. When I talk to physicians who are experiencing moral distress and moral injury as a result of having to make decisions about who should be allocated the last ventilator, whether to hold hands with a dying patient or go on to try to treat somebody who can be saved, knowing that that person dying will die alone because of hospital imposed restrictions on visitors. These are the kinds of questions that cannot be answered through narrow technical training, no matter how much expertise they have as physicians. It's grappling with the fundamental questions of human existence that comes through a liberal education. And we can look to the same for engineering case studies around Bhopal, Challenger disaster, some of the challenges that we're facing today as a society in business. And so it's the richness of human experience that has been brought about to the forefront as a result of this pandemic that I think can help us to demonstrate the value of a liberal education, as you say, now more than ever. And so I think that's the best argument. We're seeing a rise in suicides, a rise in mental illness and anguish, this rise in anti-Asian sentiment. Nothing speaks more compellingly to the need for an integrated liberal education than these complex challenges that we're facing as national and global communities.
Harold Bloom at Yale said that we read imaginative fiction because we can't know enough other people, and that the people we meet through the works that we read or the plays that we see actually affect us. And if that sounds abstract, think about the fact that for many of us, Hamlet is more of a person we wrestle with and are concerned about than perhaps the person who sat next to you in the library. So these are fictional universes that open up to us a world of understanding others, which is what we mean by empathy. The chair of mechanical engineering at Lehigh was asked, what's the most important skill for an engineer? And typically people assume the answer was going to be calculus, physics, space visualization, geometry. And you know the answer, right? The answer is empathy. Mm-hmm. She said, we build stuff for people. And if we don't understand people, how are we going to understand what to build? And those sorts of things always sound obvious at first blush. But you can go back to Steve Jobs, you can go back to Einstein, or you can, any of the ways in which, as you say, what's needed actually in the workplace. It's not a luxury. What's needed in the workplace is that kind of understanding.
Yeah, it's the capacity to speak across differences. I was observing some classes at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and students were doing their signature projects, and this was a sophomore signature project. And one group was working with coastal communities on the erosion of the shoreline and trying to convince them that they should engage in particular behavior. And the residents were convinced that talk about global warming and environmental sustainability was really a ploy by the government to get them to pay more taxes, and they just didn't believe it. And so these brilliant engineering students quickly found that the most important skill that they could have was being able to speak across those differences and communicate in ways that engendered a sense of trust in what it is that they were telling people. And I know I had that own experience, myself when I was leading a project over a 5-year period in Kenya, where we were working with engineers to engage in simple engineering solutions around clean water, sustainable agriculture, and entrepreneurship for women in Kenya's West Lake District. And this was a region that had 33% HIV rate, 69% poverty index. 80% of the families were polygamous, and they still practiced widow inheritance, where when a woman's husband died, she was inherited by a male relative to cleanse her of her dead husband's evil spirits. So no matter what kinds of engineering solutions we had, if we couldn't convince them to take advantage of these solutions because they didn't trust us, we weren't going to have any success. And so we worked with humanists, psychologists, natural resource economists, a whole range of people across disciplines in order to be able to implement the engineering solutions. And the most valuable resource we had were artists who were able to communicate messages on conga cloths, the traditional wear, to a population that was illiterate. And so these are illustrations, I think, of the ways in which we must come together and get outside of our disciplinary silos today.
So let's broaden the lens beyond just the liberal arts, talk a little higher education policy altogether. And Lynn and I are happy to keep talking, and we've got more questions that people sent in advance. But if you have questions, I'll just remind you, put them in the chat, and they will find their way up to me. How do we address the resource difference between the more elite schools, and by the way, by elite, I don't just mean privates, elite publics and privates, and those that are in a different situation? I mean, people talk about schools with giant endowments, and they typically don't realize that there aren't more than 60, 70 schools with $1 billion endowment or more, that the average endowment is closer to between 10 and $20 million, which for the average school produces a endowment per student ratio that gives you, I don't want to be cavalier about this, but essentially a rounding error. It turns out producing income off that endowment at most schools of $500, $1,000 per student. Those are tuition-driven schools. Those are schools for whom the endowment is a nice rounding factor, but not a real impact. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the handful of schools where the endowment is producing 50% of their operating budget, 60% of their operating budget. Their situation is entirely different. But that's not only not the majority, that's a pretty small number of schools. So when you look at the whole higher education ecosystem, and you look at the shock of the pandemic and the costs that have been put on the system, not just in foregone income, but the additional expenses of technology, the additional expenses of cleaning, the additional expenses of training faculty to teach in a whole different way from what they've taught. The differences that are exposed, it's not just the wealthier students and the less wealthy students, it's the wealthier institutions and less wealthy institutions. Mm-hmm. What do we do about that as a society? Is that an unsolvable problem, or are there ways forward on that one?
Yeah, I'm eager to hear your answer to this, Fred. I mean,
Hey, I asked you.
I
got a couple of thoughts I'll share, but you start.
Yeah, I think this is the most serious challenge facing higher education. It's the growing economic and therefore racial segregation. This is why it's so important to create that ascendant narrative that's going to reaffirm public trust in higher education and reassert it as a public good as opposed to a private commodity. Because we saw this transition in the 70s when we started opening the gates of the academy to women, to students of color, to first generation students, that there was a disinvestment in higher education and it started being viewed as a private commodity. We are at another inflection point, and we should be looking at ways in which we can reinvest in the way that we did with the Morel Act under the Lincoln administration and the second Morel Act that established HBCUs. And then after World War II with the GI Bill. I mean, so we're seeing some signs of hope in looking at second chance Pell Grants for incarcerated, for proposals that will double Pell Grants, that will pay for free college, although I think we need to be concerned about what the costs will be. Who's going to be covering those costs? So if we cover tuition for students, and institutions are still under-resourced, that's not going to solve the long-term problems in terms of the fact that 1 out of every 2 college students drops out, and what that will mean for the long-term goals. So for far too long, we have focused on issues of access without focusing sufficiently, I think, on issues of quality and excellence in higher education. And so this is the real challenge for us.
I think the key that you highlight is viewing education as a public good, not as a private good. And it sounds so obvious, but in fact, it helps clarify many things, and it's not always seen that way. The Morel Act which I teach in my higher education law seminar, which has the virtue of reteaching material that sometimes I feel like I know too well. When I teach it to students who don't know about it, it is nothing short of astonishing that during the Civil War, that's when the federal government decided to get involved for the first time in any kind of significant way in higher education. Don't you think somebody in Lincoln's cabinet must have said, Mr. President, this is not the time for that? And obviously, he, with support on Capitol Hill, pushed that forward. The GI Bill is one of the great and most successful social experiments we ever engaged in this society. It took an entire generation and gave them an opportunity to be educated in a way they otherwise would not. That's not the only reason that America flourished the way it did in the 1950s. Obviously, there were other macroeconomic questions and global economic questions that tilted decidedly in our favor. But part of it is that we had a workforce whose education dramatically stepped up. So that does present itself as an opportunity again. And often the discussion seems to take place not just in terms of, should we put resources into it? There are some people who want more, some people who want less, but where should those resources go? If you believe in sound bites, then debt relief is a good sound bite. The problem is that if you were to relieve all student debt, you are talking hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Is that the right place to put those hundreds of billions of dollars, or are there other places to put those? In the most recent, the American Recovery Act, most recent legislation, $40 billion goes to higher education. It's hard not to sound churlish complaining about $40 billion. That's a large sum of money. But when you put it up against about $97 billion, which was the loss and increased costs to the higher education sector, you still see the big hole there. I mean, it's easy to forget how deep this hole gets driven. My favorite example, because it's so prosaic. A major state university president was telling me about how much income was being foregone because the lack of parking on campus. Right, the parking produced enough money on a regular basis, and of course, one's inclined to roll one's eyes and say, "Come on, you're not in the parking business; you're in the education business." The parking produced income that covered about 50 faculty positions, and they rely on that. And when that money disappears, this is the kind of place that doesn't just say, "Well, then we'll just crank it out of the endowment." It's not there. So the question is the public prepared to take a deep breath and say, we have to invest in higher education. We have to reinvest in higher education. And that's particularly on the state level where that investment has gone down. I think a lot of it comes back to that trust issue that you talked about. There has to be a sense of not we and they that many states have with their higher education systems, but that sense of a public good, that what's being produced is an educated workforce, which is essential for the economy of our, not just of our big cities, but of our whole country. And as well as the research that will go forward in every area from agricultural to pharmaceutical to medical that allows us to survive. So that's a big project, and there are a lot of people who are talking about where they want funds right now. But it will be interesting to watch how much in the next legislation that's being talked about. And when I hear numbers between 2 and 4 trillion thrown around, that suggests to me that nobody really knows what's in that bill yet. Those aren't ranges; those are just numbers. But how much higher education is going to be in there? That could be broadband. That would really level out a lot of the differences in higher education access. That could be some loan forgiveness, but that could also be ways in which we understand our colleges as engines of opportunity within our communities. The coffee shop and the pizza shop and the stationery store that run because the college is running, because those students are coming back.
Yeah, part of the issue with public trust in higher education is also a result of the extreme partisanship and polarization in our society, and to some extent the weaponization of speech. And so if we look at the narrative around higher education as bastions of liberal progressivism, where we're training the next generation of snowflakes that will melt at the slightest abrasion of their sensibilities, we have to take into account that what I think are often red herrings, but some legitimate concerns around free speech on college campuses. And if you just look at Inside Higher Education Today or the Washington Post, we see our colleague Ron Crutcher at the University of Richmond, dealing with controversies over the naming of buildings and whether they should have the names of enslavers and people who supported eugenics on buildings, whether they should be erased. There was a story in Inside Higher Ed about the University of Rhode Island and a case where the chair of gender studies there had spoken out against trans rights in some sense. She was using language that the university pushed back on and said, we don't endorse this speaker's views. And she's claiming, well, that's a violation of my First Amendment rights. You're the expert on First Amendment issues. How should college and university leaders deal with these complex issues? Who gets to decide in these cases?
I'm not going to give you an answer, but I'm going to give you some questions, and I'm not being facetious. It seems to me that it's really important to think methodologically, how do we approach these things? And the most important place to begin is that we don't start in a neutral position. Is this speech good speech or bad speech? And you weigh it out that way. We start with a strong presumption in favor of speech. That's at the center of our function as creators of knowledge, discoverers of knowledge, and transmitters of knowledge through our scholarship and our teaching. So students and faculty have to be free to ask the questions they want to ask and to answer them in ways that sometimes don't make sense, but you don't know they don't make sense until you say them. Some of you have heard me tell the story of my judge, Amalia Kearse, for whom I was privileged to clerk, who, when I wrote a draft opinion I was very proud of, brought me into her side of chambers and told me it was very useful, very thoughtful, very well worked out, and we weren't going to use a word of it. And my face must have just fallen. And she said, "Don't feel bad." And then she told me the expression that I've never forgotten. She said, "I didn't know that this idea wasn't going to work until I saw that it didn't write that way. I thought it was going to work when we first talked about it, but it doesn't write that way." So sometimes you have to try out a bad idea and run it all the way through, and then you see it doesn't write that way. Or I tried to argue this in class, and by the end of class, I realized, no, I don't think I believe that. You have to be free to do that. So you start with a presumption of speech. The limits of that speech have to come way out on the horizons, and they have to be things that truly disrupt the academic program, or they have to be those things that literally threaten an individual student. Don't just make them uncomfortable, the student or other member of the community. So when a faculty member says that my free speech rights were infringed upon because the university criticized me, I remember one of these at Brandeis where I made a statement that I was going to not, there would be no sanctions against a faculty member for something that was really pretty outrageous, the faculty member had said. And trust me, I got plenty of free advice from trustees and others about what I was supposed to do about this person. So we're going to do anything. Free expression means free expression. And as long as I was president, nobody was going to be sanctioned or punished for expressing views like that. However, the university also has views, and the university can say this is antithetical to the views of this institution. So when I said that, this faculty member said to me, "You have you had a soft sanction on me in a way. You've had a chilling effect on my speech." And my response was, if what you mean by chilling effect is that I've actually kept you from being able to express your views, that's pernicious. That's inconsistent with higher education. If what you mean by chilling effect is that you don't like that I disagree with you, you've heard these views and you don't like the way your views now sound, I can't help you with that. That's the difference between free expression and therapy. This is not just that you get to talk and everybody has to agree with you. That's not even good therapy, by the way. This is free expression where you talk and then we talk. A president of a university, in my view, should be very careful about weighing in like that, because once you get in the business of calling First Amendment balls and strikes, there's no end to it. So you find your moments, you weigh in, and then you pull back out, because the goal is for this conversation to work its way up through the system, not for it to come from the top down. But there are times, in extreme cases, the hate speech cases, the white supremacist cases, where a white supremacist speaker wants to speak on campus, where it seems to me, if it's determined that this person's going to be able to speak on campus, and there are cases where it will happen and should happen, then it's incumbent upon the university to make some statement in order to message not just to those who are attacked by that, but to all of us, that this is not what the university stands for. So as I say, that doesn't give you an answer to these, but it does, I think, suggest a way in which to start that conversation. I don't know whether Ron Crutcher, who's a personal friend of both of ours, got this all right or not, but he's a thoughtful person and he's had a lot of process behind it. And he knew as soon as he pulled the trigger that not everybody was going to agree. And now it's going to play its way through. But the answer can't be threatening him, and the answer can't be, if you don't do it my way, we're going to, stop attending the school. The answer is you got to move forward on that. And Ron knows better than anybody that this was a tough decision, but he did what he thought he had to do for University of Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm often asked, you probably are too, why is, and then people fill in the blank there with their biggest issue, biggest concern. Why is this happening on campus? To which my stock response is, as opposed to where? Campus is a microcosm of what's happening in our society. So wherever you have a core issue, you have that expressing itself on campus. So particularly as schools come back in person in the fall, which I think most schools will really begin to do in a serious way, how do you see this whole year of increased awareness of racial reckoning playing out on our campuses?
Well, I think it will get increased attention, and that we need to start looking at it as a high impact practice, ways in which we can take advantage of student activism and in relation to curricular and co-curricular activities, and look at it as a learning experience. Our students, as you rightly point out, are not coming in isolation. They have backgrounds, they have lived experiences that inform their day-to-day activities. And this is what a liberal education is for. I mean, that's why, we know that democracy is not self-sustaining. It relies on cultivating the habits of heart and mind that will produce engaged citizens. And this should be happening on our campuses and in our communities. And we must find a way to partner with K through 12, business, industry, and community members to ensure that students have these experiences that will rely on the education that we're offering them.
To a certain extent, I suppose, getting people back to campus does have some impact of flattening out some of the differences that were really exposed during the pandemic. One of the things that in many ways, I guess you'd say colleges are most successful at in the last couple of decades is dramatically diversifying their student body, and not just racially, although I mean that too, but in terms of economics, in terms of first generation students coming to college, in terms of international students, and the international students themselves are surprisingly diverse. They are the full pay students from China, Korea, Japan, the Middle East, but they are also the strivers from overseas who could never have imagined studying in the United States and then have a whole world open to them. So all of that, when they get thrown back to the four corners of the world, on the one hand, it's very moving. When I do these Phi Beta Kappa induction ceremonies now virtually, one of the things that's very moving is that instead of a room full of people and their families all dressed up, which is impressive too, I get little boxes all over the world. And you can see people in all sorts of circumstances, and that's really very moving. At the same time, I know from my own teaching, there are students who have the cameras off a lot because their bandwidth is low or because they don't really want their classmates seeing the circumstances which they live, or both. So we've been successful in part, not 100%, once we get people on campus and being able to say, in the room, everybody's equal. So I think we'll be able to alleviate some of that.
Yeah, but you and I have talked quite a bit about cost savings with respect to the way that curricula have been delivered this year through our own associations. The fact that we can have meetings virtually and not in person saves money. It promotes environmental sustainability. And yet we believe deeply in the value of face-to-face residential liberal education. What do you think is the future for higher education? Will there be increased reliance on hybrid models, on virtual learning?
It's a great question. And of course, the real answer is we're going to find out a lot this coming year. But I think the answer is that there is no going back completely to the way things used to be. That particular river only runs in one direction, and we'll keep moving forward on that. So we now know we have capacities we didn't used to have. Let's take some sort of simple examples. My first class of my seminar a couple of years ago, it's a spring term class. It was January, and it was a blizzard. So we lost the first class and met once a week. And the next Monday was Martin Luther King Day. So my first class wasn't until 3 weeks into the semester. We made it up, but that's no way to teach a class. That will never happen again. When there's a blizzard, we'll all just go online. So that's an easy example, and that's a good one. In terms of cost savings for universities, I think you will definitely see schools continuing to take advantage of that. Meetings that used to require getting everybody to certain places at a certain time don't have to happen that way. Conferences that faculty members will attend that don't necessarily require people traveling all over the world in order to have the interaction that's very important for them as academics. I think you'll see that as well. I think there are class opportunities that we can now use. The example I gave earlier of foreign language instruction, where schools can pool their resources, and one school may, be the place where everybody studies Portuguese, and someplace else is the school where they study languages from sub-Saharan Africa. And the benefit that they all get from that will have a lot to do with what technology will make possible. So I think you'll see that as well. A much more primitive version of this, when I was a law school dean here in Washington, D.C., one of my relatively young alumni was one of the most prominent practitioners in the field of financial instruments that were compliant with Islamic law. Islamic law, as I found out, has got all sorts of restrictions on interest. And so they had a whole system based around financial instruments, some of them running well into the billions of dollars, that had to be compliant with Islamic law. So we reached out to him to teach a course, and he taught a course for students at a university in the Middle East, at Aligarh Muslim University outside of Delhi, and at my campus, George Washington University. It worked fine. The technology was a little clunky because this is 10, 15 years ago. I mean, today this would be like nothing. So I think you'll see some of that. It will make it easier to deliver distance education of a high quality to people for whom that's the only option. The thing I worry about is if it becomes a overall replacement for the importance of in-person study. I don't see that happening certainly at top tier universities. I think as the financial circumstances remain under stress, you're going to see more of that. I mean, what are you hearing from the presidents of your members about how much hybrid they want to hang on to even as they come back to campus?
Most would like to return to face-to-face. They're looking at trying to increase revenue through now these new modes of curriculum delivery that many of them haven't engaged in before. So they're not ASU, they're not Southern New Hampshire University. They haven't done this. So now they're thinking, oh, okay, we can engage with this new population, create access in new ways, especially with non-traditional age learners. But most are looking at this as supplemental revenue, as opposed to this is going to be the way that we're going to approach higher education for the future.
So, Lynn, let me ask you the 3 o'clock in the morning question. What's the one that keeps you up most at night about the role or the status or the challenges of higher education? Not looking at the next quarter or the next academic year, but looking down the road.
Well, as I mentioned, I think our most significant concern is the economic segregation in higher education. But we also are dealing with an age of anti-intellectualism, anti-scientific research. We're in a post-truth era. And so much of the work that we do, in fact, almost all of it, is dependent upon an acceptance of rational argument. And so what does this mean for us in moving forward and looking at how we can fulfill our mission of creating knowledge, of working with communities, of ensuring the next generation of leaders who will dismantle a belief in a hierarchy of human value, who will sustain our democracy. This is troubling to me because when I listen to Senate hearings or, just watch the evening news, I think arguments don't matter anymore. Something else is going on. And this is a challenge for all of us in society, not just those of us in higher education, but this is directly within our purview. What about you?
Well, a cousin of that, I think. The fact that there are challenges to the respect for higher education or the belief in higher education or trust in higher education, that's troubling. It's not new, but it's troubling. The fact that it breaks down quite so dramatically by party affiliation and by politics is extremely troublesome to me. Higher education traditionally was not thought of as a partisan issue, or to the extent it was, perhaps ironically, there was more support coming from more conservative voters who tended to be establishment voters and believe in the institutions of the establishment. And higher education was considered one of those institutions. So pretty ironic that that now is turned around, but you do have this great divide. Now, this is the risk of taking the temperature of this issue too quickly. We don't want to try to get historical perspective on the moment that we're living through. But this happened pretty dramatically if you look at the graphs over the last 4 years, where the difference between identifying Democrats, identifying Republicans on their attitude towards higher education they were there, but they were small until about 2015. And then that difference really, really widened. So that bears watching to see if that's going to happen. But if it's seen as a political issue, then the public spending on higher education, the state systems, takes on a different view. Then the lack of trust in higher education, the post-truth, as you described it, takes on a different element, and potentially a very dangerous one.
Yeah, I mean, it's also concerning that if you look at the demographic data, it's the 18 to 25-year-olds who have the least amount of faith that higher education is going to make a difference in their lives, and those are the very people that we want in the academy.
To be crude, they are the customers, and if they're not buying the bananas, then you've lost your base. So we got a question in, which is a sort of Phi Beta Kappa inside question, but I'm happy to contextualize it a little bit. Whether offering foreign languages from other colleges will have an impact on Phi Beta Kappa stipulations in terms of the language requirement. Phi Beta Kappa requires foreign language capacity up to an intermediate level as part of one's study, in addition to the other aspects of being near the top of one's class, et cetera, for Phi Beta Kappa membership. My own view on that one is that the opportunity for consortia among schools may be the solution for the schools that are saying, we would love to offer more foreign language courses, but it's simply not cost effective. And we're looking for ways to make cuts that are consistent with our mission and also consistent with the demand of our students. So it may well be, and this will have to be worked out, but if it allows the school to, in a way that keeps them operating as a liberal arts school, to be able to share and collaborate with others, then I think that's not the problem. That's the solution. The problem will be if schools say, we no longer care about foreign language study. I remember we had the Key into Public Service convening last spring. One of our participants is a major State Department figure. He was I believe, part of the Biden transition team, and his name has been mentioned for possibly ambassador to China. This is Nick Burns, who was asked about, what would you tell young people today about their education? And I didn't prep him for this, and he wouldn't have taken it from me if I tried to. But the first thing he said is language capacity. If they're going to be global citizens, they're going to be out there in the world. They better get over thinking they can just do it in English. Well, that is part of the reason for a language requirement. So we believe in that, but we also know that schools have a hard time delivering that. So this may be the solution. Well, we are approaching the 5 o'clock hour. I appreciate you all being with us. I think you get a chance to see one of the true pleasures I get once a week. Lynn and I do some business at the Phi Beta Kappa Society as well in those board chair CEO discussions. I think those of you involved in not-for-profits or for-profits know that that relationship between the chair of the board and the chief executive officer is absolutely critical to the success of the institution. But I would say that Lynn and I treat ourselves to a little bit of this kind of conversation on a weekly basis too, and wonderful to have all of you listening in and being part of it today. People tend to ask at this point in the conversation, what can I do to help? And I got a rule in the secretary's office, never make people ask to help twice. So for people who want to get involved, obviously you are already supporters of Phi Beta Kappa, and I'm grateful for that. But another thing that you can do is to go to our Advocacy for the Liberal Arts and Sciences Toolkit. It's easy to find on the PBK website. You go to the Get Involved tab and go down to Advocate for the Arts and Sciences. I think Aurora Sherman, my executive assistant, is going to put in the chat the link to it. But if you don't have that handy, then just go to the website pbk.org and go to Get Involved and Advocate for the Arts and Sciences, and you'll see a lot of the work that can be done. Yes, on the federal level, and that's what we tend to talk about most. But I'll tell you what, on the state level, where sometimes the impact is greater and where the need is greater. So if you want to get involved in some of the issues we've been talking about, Phi Beta Kappa members on the ground can make an enormous difference. We'd be grateful if you would. Thank you all for your support for Phi Beta Kappa for the Arts and Sciences. I look forward, when the circumstances permit, to seeing as many of you as possible back out on the road and to continuing to work together on the issues that we all care about. Everybody take care, stay safe, be